So it's now time to give the floor to the first speaker. So it's my pleasure to introduce our first invited, John Abowd. He's the US Census Bureau Associate Director for Research and Methodology and the Chief Scientist. He's leading the agency effort to create a differentially private protection system for the 2020 census and future data products. And he has a long experience with the applications of differential privacy, started as early as 2008, when he led the team that created the world's first application of differential privacy protection system for the program's on-the-map job location tool. John is also the Edmund Ezra Day Professor of Economic Statistics and Information Science at Cornell. He is a fellow and past president of the Society of Labor Economists. He's also fellow of the American Statistical Association and Economic Society, as well as an elected member of the International Statistical Institute. So without further ado, I leave you the floor for.
Thank you very much, Nando, for that lovely introduction. I'll try to share my screen here. To practice, it should be fine. I think we're ready to go. Thanks to the organizers for this invitation. I'm delighted to be here. You wouldn't know this, but this is my first public statement about differential privacy in more than 4 months, and that is not an accident. But I'm glad to be able to speak again in public about this important subject. So I'm going to give you something that we do at meetings now at the Census Bureau. I'm going to give you the bottom line up front. And there it is. This is the single biggest lesson. And it's not a surprising lesson to an economist. It is sometimes surprising to others, but it kind of states the obvious. If the alternative is you're not going to see anything, then you're ecstatic when someone applies differential privacy and you get to see useful statistics. If, on the other hand, the alternative is we're going to stop publishing the confidential microdata, even though we never intended to publish them in the first place, and give you properly protected statistics, then there's a lot more, the polite term is public discussion, and I'll let you fill in your own term for the how you want to characterize the discourse. As Nando mentioned when he introduced me, the Census Bureau is no stranger to applying formal privacy protection systems to get new products out the door. So the one he referred to, there's a screenshot of it. Well, by the way, in my slides, the links are active, and I will send them to Nando, and I will respond to requests to send them out. I don't think you're planning to post them, but if you are, you're welcome to post them as soon as you get them. So this is the On the Map application, and in fact, what I'm showing you is Ithaca, New York, which is where I lived for 30 years. And I'm showing you a choropleth map of where people live who work in the Ithaca, New York, which is a census place. And it's resolved down to the census block. And so where did I used to live? I actually don't think you can see my pointer. I used to live right where that 13 is, which is State Route 13, in one of those clusters. And I worked inside Ithaca proper. Actually worked at Cornell right about here. So you can construct these, and the residential side was protected by one of the first formal privacy systems that was invented, actually the first formal privacy system, differentially private application in the world in production. That's our oldest product with formal privacy protections. Oh, I clicked on the active link and that was a bad thing. Sorry. On the right screen now. There we go. This is the newest product with formal privacy protections. And your speaker in a little while, Ashwin Machandwahala, collaborated with us, as he did in the one I showed the first. I probably should have called out the collaborators the first time too, Dan Kiefer and Ashwin, when they were postdoc and graduate student respectively at Cornell, and their supervisor, Johannes Gurka, and I and Lars Verhuber put the math and application together for that. This is the Veterans Employment Outcome Explorer, and it basically shows you the earnings that people who leave the military have the year they leave the military, 5 years out and 10 years out, for very detailed characteristics of the job you were doing in the military. It is 100% differentially private, and it replaced a product that showed you nothing, or what you could piece together from other public use products. So it has been very well received. It builds on one that does the same thing for recent college graduates. Again, 1 year, 5 year, and 10 years out. That is, without a doubt, the most well-tuned description of the earnings possibilities of college graduates. So if the system that you went to college or considering going to college in is part of that post-secondary employment opportunity consortium, now pushing 30 or more systems, so there are quite a few, then you can learn quite a lot from it. So those are examples of differential privacy replacing full suppression. Nothing existed, and then there was something, and it has been extremely well received. The On the Map application, the one I showed you first, I can go back there, that has been tuned by the Federal Emergency Management Association, agency rather, in collaboration with the Census Bureau to provide emergency management real time, where people live and where they work, and storm paths, wildfire paths, other natural disasters. That's been running for almost a decade as well. But that's not what we're talking about today. Today, we're talking about the 2020 Census of Population and Housing. And it has basically 5 major statistical products. The first one involves 50 numbers that are used to apportion the House of Representatives. At the same time, we released the population of the states, the resident population. We released the resident population of the District of Columbia and the Commonwealth of Puerto Rico, but neither of those two figure into the allocation for seats in the US House of Representatives. So really that's 50 numbers. They are protected only by aggregation. So they're what we called in our implementation invariant. I'm not going to get into those technical details today, but suffice it to say that they are more than just technical details. And in other talks, we have gone into great detail on them. The next thing, and the one I am going to talk a lot about today, is we supply the data to all of the redistricting efforts in every state. Now it does include the District of Columbia and Puerto Rico. And those redistricting data are used to redraw congressional districts, state legislative districts, county elective legislative agencies, school boards, the gamut, from voting areas that are very small, census places with less than 500, to voting areas that are huge, the city of New York. So it is an extremely challenging use case, and that's why I thought it might be fun to do that with a group of practitioners. The next is demographic and housing characteristics. If you're a seasoned census data user, this is the replacement for Summary File 1. And then the detailed race and ethnicity data and the American Indian, Alaska Native Hawaiian summary data file were called Summary File 2 and AIAN Summary File in 2010. In 2010, that collection of statistical products was more than 150 billion statistics. The reason why you can't do it as accurately as down to the units column is because you have to count the zeros, and some of the zeros are implicit and some of the zeros are explicit, but all of the zeros are known, so they are in fact statistics from the underlying confidential database. That's where that 150 billion comes from about 15 gigabytes of data. As I point out when I give this talk to big data audiences, That's less than the amount of worldwide cellular traffic that happens in a second. So it's not a lot of data. It's definitely not what is generally considered big data. How did we expose the vulnerability of the 2010 census? A lot of people have seen this, but I like to repeat it because it bears repeating. So in the 2010 census, we collected data on about 309 million individuals. There were about 1.9 billion confidential data points. Those are the variables times the number of people. And we released, as I said before, over 150 billion statistics. So we did internal research to confirm that the 2003 database reconstruction result, that if you release too many statistics too accurately, you put the entire confidential database of any field that you published at risk. And that's exactly what happened. So what happened is we reconstructed a record for every single person who was enumerated in the 2010 census, all 309 million of them. And that was exactly right down to their census block. That means every single one of them was in the correct census block. And we knew whether you were a child or adult, defining adult as whether you're of voting age. So all 6.2 million census blocks that had people in them were correctly populated with people in these reconstructed data. That I don't want to be over dramatized. That was a feature, not a bug of the system. That was intended, and indeed it happened. So then we reconstructed, in addition to the block, the individual's sex, age in years, race in all 63 OMB categories, and ethnicity. Ethnicity is only in two flavors, Hispanic or non-Hispanic. So there are 2 times 63, 126 different categories of race and ethnicity. In the reconstructed data, that is exactly right for 46% of the population. Meaning when you compare it back to the confidential data, it's exactly right. If you allow age to be off by a plus or minus 1 year, then it's right for 71% of the population. That just tells you how reliable the reconstruction is. It's extremely reliable. We then did a re-identification exercise. So we took the block sets and age and linked to commercial data that were ingested at the same time as the 2010 census. So they were commercial databases. I can't tell you which ones they are, but I will tell you you've heard of all 4 of them. And combined them, and we attached the name and address using the reconstructed census data to 45% of the population. That's 138 million individuals. We then checked whether the name, block, sex, age, race, and ethnicity on those re-identified individuals were correct. Age is allowed to be off by plus or minus 1 year. That's really a function of the date on which you take the age. It's not anything particularly profound. It's exactly right for 52 million people, or 38% of the putative re-identifications. So if you're properly re-identified, then a person using the data has learned the race and ethnicity that you reported on the 2020 census, and there is no other source for that. So that's the harm. Whether you consider that to be a big harm or a small harm is really immaterial. It's not supposed to happen. It's prohibited by Section 9 of Title 13. So since the existing protection system demonstrably compromises the confidentiality of the data, the stewards, that is me and my senior colleagues' career at the Census Bureau, would now be willfully violating Section 9 of Title 13 if we just did this again. This message has been slow to sink in, so I'm just going to say it in the simplest sentence that I know. It is not an option to go back. So what did the Census Bureau decide to do? Well, it's clear that this kind of re-identification isn't going to get harder in the 10 years since 2010 to 2020. It's only going to get easier. And the methods that were used in 2010 provably did not defend against this style of attack. So if it's not an option to use them, then the only option is to design something that does work. And while this is a difficult position for a statistical agency to be in, it's not an unusual situation from a data security point of view. When a vulnerability is exposed, and you didn't understand that vulnerability when you designed the system, you have to immediately take action and then begin engineering a fix. The comparable situation that I like to use is the first time a quantum computer can reliably break RSA encryption, we're going to have to stop using RSA encryption. And no, we don't have a substitute for it. But that doesn't mean we can keep using it until we have one. The vulnerability is there. So we had to develop a substitution for the method that was used in 2010, which is called household swapping. All right. And we now have a really incredibly diverse user community engaged in the debate about how accurate these data have to be versus the privacy loss that publication of census results at this scale demands. There's going to be some privacy loss. That's an important concession. You can't have perfect privacy. I don't think that's a secret to anyone here, but you also can't do this. You don't have your video on, you can't see me waving my hands. This is not a proof that your data protection system works. Math is a proof that your data protection system works. So I just thought I'd tell you that once again, it is it's basically the associate directors, the career associate directors, who are in charge of arbitrating the diverse use cases and assigning the amount of privacy loss budget that each will get and balancing the interests of the diverse user community. And believe me, that is a hard job. And just because it's a hard job doesn't mean that we can ignore it. We have to do our best to do that. So that's why I want to walk you through the redistricting example, because it's really a very good example of how to think about this problem. Right? So all the 2020 census publications, all the things I showed you at the top of this talk, they will be processed by a collection of differentially private algorithms. They will use a total privacy loss budget. If you prefer calling it a privacy cost, that's fine with me. That is set as policy, not hardwired, and is determined by the Data Stewardship Executive Policy Committee. That is the most senior committee of career civil servants at the Census Bureau. It's chaired by the Chief Operating Officer, who is also now the Acting Director, Ron Jarman. We have released the preliminary code base twice now. We will release the final actual code base, the Python and Garovi code that was used to do this. A full set of technical documents, which are updates of the ones we've already released. And we have released extensive demonstration data products, and we'll release at least 2 more on the way to producing the first of the products, redistricting data. There's lots of information at this link, which I'm going to try to avoid clicking on. I also wanted to walk through a fairly old presentation that I've done about this system that stresses just how important algorithmic design is. Now, I'm actually going to show you charts that were drawn by the very first versions of the top-down algorithm that we implemented and tested against the 1940 census. The 1940 census has been public because it's more than, 72 years old. So what this does is it applies differential privacy in a way that I will describe in a second. And we compared it to what you would do if I handed you the data and say, use the simplest thing you can think of. The simplest thing you can think of is to define the smallest unit that you're going to publish, which is a census block in 2020, but which was an enumeration district in 1940. Add the noise, and then accumulate all the statistics. It's basically the way local differential privacy works, although it is not an example of local DP. It's not the records that are modified. It's the lowest geographic level of aggregation that's modified. And then you build up all the aggregates. It is possible to build every aggregate from the census blocks, right? Okay. In comparison, what the top-down algorithm does is it allocates a portion of the privacy cost, privacy loss budget, to each level of a geographic hierarchy. I'm going to show you some examples of that hierarchy, and then allocates at each level some of the privacy loss budget or privacy cost to each query set at that level, doing proper privacy accounting of so that you can ensure that the global privacy loss budget was not exceeded, right? And then it does a multi-pass optimization at each level. It solves a non-negative least squares problem to get tables that are not negative, i.e. No entry in any of the tables is negative, and fully consistent. And then it solves a mixed integer linear program to get non-negative integer tables at each level of the geographic hierarchy that are consistent with all the levels above. And the most important of these is the last bullet. At the lowest level of geography, a census block, at the most detailed level of table, that is in statistical terms, a fully saturated contingency table, which is just a contingency table representation of microdata. So that table, set of tables, is converted back to microdata. And then those microdata are used to tabulate everything. Okay, so here's what happens if you use the naive algorithm. That is, so in 1940, it was district by district, not block by block. So you apply the noise at the blue level in this chart, what's called an enumeration district, and then you create county statistics, state statistics, and national statistics from that noise. So on the x-axis is the privacy loss budget, the global one, and on the y-axis is a particular measure of accuracy that we were using at that time. You don't really need to know the details of it, except that if the protected data exactly match the confidential data, then the accuracy is 1. And if the protected data are fully random, the accuracy is 0. And it looks like a receiver operating characteristics curve if you're a statistician. So you're trying to get to the 0-1 point up here in the northwest corner, and of course you can't get there. But what is distressing about this is that the national statistics are really no more accurate than the enumeration or the lowest level statistics. That is an unacceptable property for a statistical agency to build into its products. There were 309 million people used to estimate that national, sorry, that's 1940. There were 140 million people used to estimate that national line, and an average of about 1,200 people used in each district. This is just unacceptable. A statistical system that the Census Bureau uses can't have this property. So the top-down algorithm provably doesn't have that property, and here's a demonstration of it. You can see that the chart for the enumeration district, the blue line again, looks pretty much the same as it did on the earlier chart. In fact, it's better, but I'm not going to show you that. That's just a byproduct. It's only a little bit better, so there's not much point in harping on it. But then every other statistic is much better, and it's much better because as the population covered in the statistic increases, the statistic gets more accurate. Now I will peel the onion back a little bit and tell you that this property only provably holds if the geographic entity that we are looking at is on that geographic hierarchy that the top-down algorithm was optimized over. And we chose a statistical hierarchy because those are set up to try to get balance in terms of the population at each level, except for when it switches to political entities, counties, states, and the nation. Below the county, they're tuned to provide this kind of accuracy. But I can tell you the obvious, that if you feed the top-down algorithm 11 billion differentially private measurements, it'll do a really good job and it will make absolutely no one happy. Some of the longest meetings we have had at that Data Stewardship Executive Policy Committee have been over whether that's good enough. And either good enough in the protection dimension or good enough in the accuracy dimension. There's just no easy answer because the math doesn't give you that answer. The math gives you the trade-off between accuracy and privacy loss. And it's a public policy decision how to implement that trade-off and where to be on that curve. And nothing about anything that I talk about or that any of you do in designing algorithms is ever going to change that it is a policy decision how much to compromise privacy in order to get accuracy for a demonstrated use case. All right? But accuracy, of course, is just as multidimensional as the statistical database that we're trying to make accurate. Accurate to whom? According to whom? So yes, there are formal privacy guarantees, and they respect the given privacy loss budget. But I need to tell you the output metric. I need to say why these are fit for use for a specific use, not portmanteau, they're good for any use. The only thing good for any use is the exact confidential microdata, and that's off the table. All right. So distinct groups of data users will have particular analyses that they want accurate, and that's fine. Tuning accuracy for one analysis, though, can reduce accuracy for other analyses, and I'm going to show you some good examples of that. And policymakers have to consider reasonable overall accuracy metrics in making these privacy trade-offs. The nice thing about the redistricting application is that you can lay out the problem and be relatively certain you've described it properly. So redistricting has to draw legislative districts for politically defined entities of arbitrary size. And I didn't actually put this in there, but I'm going to get to it in a second. And they don't respect any hierarchy except by agreement. They can all be built from census blocks. Now, it's not like you define the blocks and then everything else gets built. The blocks are defined after overlaying all the existing political boundaries and other statistical entities onto a map of the United States. And then the block boundaries are drawn so that you can construct all of them from these blocks and respecting other constraints. So in legislative districts in the United States, they have to have approximately equal populations. The congressional districts are only allowed to be off by plus or minus one without some really good reason, but they're huge. They're going to be about 1 million people each, and so that's not a big deal. Below that, the scrutiny is subject to reasonableness rules that are specified in many cases by state legislatures. The Supreme Court has recognized 5 and even 10% population variation as respecting the one person, one vote requirements. But they must also be drawn so that they're consistent with what's called Section 2 scrutiny under the 1965 Voting Rights Act, which means that you can't pile all of a minority population into a few districts that have 90 or 95% minority and then put the rest of the population in other districts. You can't dilute the voting power of minorities that way. So you have to create majority-minority districts with approximately 50% or more minority population when it's feasible to do so. So the analysis statistic that matters the most is what is the population share of the largest minority or the largest race and ethnic group. They're not necessarily a minority. Non-Hispanic whites can be a large race ethnic group. And it turns out that you only need to focus on 2 statistics to get the redistricting case right. You need to focus on total population and on the ratio of the largest race or ethnic population to total population. Those are the statistics that are used. That's the good news. The bad news is because of all the arbitrary geography, off-spine entities matter. And so the error accumulates according to 2 things. First, the population. The more population there is, the smaller the error. But the farther the entity is from that geographic spine, the larger the error. And we have developed a measure. It's called the off-spine distance. It measures the minimum number of geographic entities that are on the spine that you have to add up to get this off-spine entity. And the error increases with that off-spine distance. I didn't write the math in here for you, but our future presentations will elaborate. So here's why this is so challenging. This is the real hierarchical representation of census data, the official map. It's in almost every publication that you get from the Census Bureau. It starts down here at census blocks. And this is what we call the statistical spine: block groups, census tracts, counties, states. We don't worry about the things between states and the nation. But look at the problem. Suppose I take congressional districts. They go from census blocks to congressional districts right back to states. Right? So they're off spine. They're not pulled back into the block groups, the tracts, or the counties. On the other hand, most voting districts, because they respect political boundaries, are pulled back to the spine at the county level, but not state legislative districts, right? Not census places. That's an important one, Scott. I'm going to use those in a second. Okay? And way over here, a very important legislative and constitutionally protected minority, American Indian, Alaska Native, and Native Hawaiians, is essentially completely off the spine. Right? They have their own spine. It starts with census blocks, but it doesn't pull back to states. It defines American Indian areas, off-reservation land trusts, tribally designated statistical areas, and the other entities you see in this slide, all of which are off the central spine of that hierarchy I showed you before. So what does this problem look like when you get down to actually doing redistricting? Well, here's an example. In 2010, this is being drawn, this is the redistricting of the state Senate in New York following the 2010 census. And the green boundaries here are the districts for the state Senate. And here is a Section 2 Voting Rights Act analysis of Senate District 48, which happens to include the house I lived in when I lived in upstate New York. And you can see that this particular Senate district is 91.8% white, and then a trivial number of percentage of minorities. And you can also do this voting age citizens. I'm not going to get into the other criteria for meeting Section 2 scrutiny, but you have to form this race ethnicity breakdown here for every one of these districts and show that you're complying by not stacking up all the minorities in a small number of districts. And then none of these, by the way, respect anything other than the blocks on the state. And then there's a lower house, the assembly. There's a whole different set. And over here is the analysis for Assembly District 125, which once again happens to include the house that I lived in when I lived in upstate New York, and its race ethnicity breakdown. This is just one. These are just two of the uncountably large number of possibilities that could have been the New York State redistricting. I didn't even blow up New York City for you, but it's no accident that you can see there aren't 125 up here in the big part of New York. You need all the ones down here on Long Island too. So I'm going to show you statistics now from the last demonstration product that we released, which was released on November 16th of 2020. And this is accuracy statistics for an on-spine entity, counties. There are 3,143 counties in the United States. Puerto Rico is not included in these statistics. It is in the spreadsheets and other products that are cited here. All right. So how accurate is the population of these counties? So I'm showing you the four most popular accuracy statistics: the mean absolute error, the L1 error, the root mean squared error, the square root of the L2 error, the mean absolute percentage error, which is the error divided by the population, and the coefficient of variation, which is the standard deviation divided by the estimate, also expressed as a percentage. Okay, so what you can see is that relative to the population sizes, these errors are extremely small at this privacy loss budget, which was 4. And in particular, they're relatively constant as you go from counties with less than 1,000 to counties with 100,000 or more. That is because this is an on-spine entity, counties, and because the accuracy is fully under the control of the privacy loss budget. Right? And you can see that the errors in percentage terms are absolutely trivial for counties with populations above 5,000. But there are a lot of counties that are smaller than that, 268 in this range and 35 that have less than 1,000. The county is a very heterogeneous population entity to study, but it's the smallest political entity that's tabulated. That statement wasn't technically true, but I won't give you the long footnote, okay? A very important summary area, I called it out when I was showing you the hierarchy, is what's called summary level 160 incorporated places or census places, okay? Those aren't quite the same, but they're close enough. There's 19,540 of these, and more importantly, there's a huge number of them with small populations less than 500, 6,100 of them, and populations between 500 and 999, about 3,000 of them. Now, what you can see here is that the errors are not bad. They're roughly constant until you get to the largest off-spine entities here where they start to grow, okay? So what you're seeing is that they should get more accurate as the population gets larger, but they get less accurate as the number of on-spine geographic entities you have to add up gets bigger. And so these larger census places, it takes more blocks and block groups and tracks. Our algorithm figures out the smallest number that you need, but nevertheless, that number grows the larger is the entity. One of these is LA County, for example, which is a pretty large entity. All right. Now, demographers who put together these error metrics prefer to think of the accuracy of the Hispanic population, an example of an ethnic group, in terms of the absolute error in that population or the percentage error in that population. So here you can see at the state and county level, so this is basically the 3,100 counties, that the mean absolute error for Hispanic or Latino is about 33 persons, root mean squared error is about 51 persons, and the percentage error is about 11%. I can't see the CV because your lovely pictures are covering it. Let me see if I can stop that first. Yeah, so it's the CV is actually still pretty small, 0.32%. But that's much bigger for Hispanics than it is for non-Hispanics. Those are much, much smaller in terms of percentage errors for the non-Hispanic population. The absolute errors are about the same, and that's not a surprise, right? Because they're both big enough to get in the range. And this is an on-spine entity, so the only thing that's going on here is population size. But when you get down to counties with populations of 0 to 9 Hispanic or Latino, they're phenomenally inaccurate in the opinion of the demographers. On the other hand, that's completely irrelevant to the redistricting use case because they're never going to constitute a large enough minority in those areas to get any political representation. So the use case should give that very little weight and does in fact give it very little weight. When you go off spine, again to summary level 160, state, place, and incorporated places, you get the same message that when there's enough people that the situation is accurate. So down here, incorporated places with populations of 100 or more of these, percentage errors are still pretty big, but that's the wrong percentage error. 8.12 is not the right percent. You don't care about the percentage error in the Hispanic population. You care about the error in the ratio of that number to the total population, which is much lower, as it turns out. So I've shown you the examples. These multiply when you get to using all the race categories. So here we have the white alone, black alone, AIAN, Asian, Native Hawaiian, Pacific Islander, and some other race alone, and then 2 or more races. Now, what leaps out from this table? Even at the state level, there's only 51 states, DC counts for the purposes of this table, is the error in the Native Hawaiian, Pacific Islander race group considered by itself. Right? From a demographic analysis point of view, that's a pretty large error, but Native Hawaiian and Pacific Islanders are only going to get political representation in approximately 2 of those 51 states. It doesn't matter that there's a small number of them in the other states. And it matters for some purposes that are outside the scope of redistricting, which states those are, and a detailed race and ethnicity product will produce a more accurate estimate of that. Right? So this is the right way to think about the error problem for redistricting. You computer scientists will immediately recognize this as alpha beta error. I restated it this way because it's not the way I tell it to my colleagues, so you would recognize it as alpha beta error. So you want to define a statistic on the top-down algorithm and the same statistic on the confidential data, which is called the CEF. So the absolute difference between those two can either be interpreted as L1 or root mean squared error, because you get the same number either way in a univariate analysis, and this is a univariate analysis. That thing has to be less than or equal to alpha, the accuracy target, at least 1 minus beta % of the time, right? So what is the statistic? The statistic is the population of the largest race or ethnic group in the geographic area divided by the total population in that geographic area. And I invite you to do the approximation math to convince yourself that if you control this statistic to alpha beta accuracy, total population will be at least as good as alpha beta. It's in the denominator here. So if you're not controlling the denominator accurately enough, you won't be able to control the ratio of the numerator to the denominator accurately enough. This is actually what we're tuning the redistricting data to do. And as it turns out, we're able to meet those targets for populations of at least 500, which is a smaller number than the Department of Justice asked us to target, with privacy loss budgets that are defensible. They're not, these results aren't public yet. They will be in the next demonstration data product. And I confidently predict, and I'm ahead of that, that when they are released, many other use cases will not look good, because when you squeeze on the top-down algorithm to make it perform against one use case, the errors pop out someplace else and you're not controlling for them correctly if the redistricting use case is the right use case to control for. Right? This is a much harder problem for the general purpose demographic and housing characteristics, DHC, and we haven't proposed a small set of portmanteau accuracy measures for that yet. We have another tool under development. So what we've done, basically, by having this very public discussion of how well the 2020 Census Disclosure Avoidance System works, is we've taken the privacy protection out of the shadows, or as one privacy lawyer put it about a year and a half ago, the Census Bureau turned on the lights and nobody was very happy with the sausage factory. But it's better, it's much better to have this discussion than to have this kind of proof and security by obscurity. So some of these obfuscation methods were provably insecure and they're gone. Our demonstration data products have been the most transparent view into Census Bureau privacy practices ever, full stop, without qualification. And we have greatly benefited from the feedback we have gotten, especially from our most strenuous critics. So, and they're still not happy. I don't want to say we've made them happy. I don't think we're going to be able to make them completely happy. But they have found things that we didn't find, and it's only because of this bringing it out of the shadows. So I tried to leave some time. Again, these are resources that you can use if you want. I tried to leave some time for questions, and so I didn't leave very much. I apologize. I was a little bit more long-winded. I'm always long-winded on this subject, but I will stop now. Thank you very much.
Thank you, John, for this very fantastic talk. So we have some time for questions. We have a little buffer for the next session later on. So please go ahead. If there's any question from the audience, please raise your hand and we'll give you access to the microphone, or you can send your message in the chat. And meanwhile, I guess questions come from the audience. I have a quick question for you, John. So my question is mainly about the computational complexity about this algorithm here. So I'm worried that so you're saying that you're solving this mixed integer linear program for redistributing the noise essentially. And so if you solve this exactly, obviously this is an NPR problem. And so at which point do we worry about complexity with the population size that you have?
Thank you for that question. It has a very good answer. At the point at which we implement the rounding, we prove that the total unimodularity holds for that system. And so we are able to get an answer back that is known to be the integer solution. And that was a very hard proof to do because it matters how certain of the operational invariants are implemented, the extent to which you can do it. And it also matters how you state or pose the rounding problem.
I see. Okay. Yes. So the rounding here, just a follow-up question. The rounding is can be unbiased, right? So that's I assume that
cannot be unbiased.
So you don't have
that's the essence of the problem. The non-negativity constraints take away unbiasedness, and rounding doesn't make them come back.
Right.
My screen just blanked. There we go. Okay. So we basically teaching the community that if they don't want to do the consistency analysis themselves, and if we are constrained to publish 100% fully consistent statistics, so they have to be tabulated from a single microdata input, then some statistics are going to be biased. And it's worse than that, as it turns out. As it turns out, the smallest expected maximum error is a function of both the global privacy loss budget and the number of queries, and it goes in the wrong direction on the number of queries part. So you basically, that's what I was saying at the end in non-technical terms. When you smush those 3 billion statistics into a form where they satisfy a tight fitness for use criterion, they pop out someplace else, usually in the form of some block that looks wildly different from the confidential data. You know, one block out of 8 million.
Right.
I know it's going to happen. I don't know which one it's going to be, and the critics call it the dash lottery, but the dash lottery doesn't affect the redistricting use case, as it turns out. So but it does affect other things, and so some criteria that arbitrate that worst case are going to have to be introduced for the general purpose statistics, but they don't. It just doesn't matter for the redistricting case. So I don't care where it pops out. Sure. I see that Audra has her hand up.
I do. I think I am also unmuted. Great talk. So you mentioned, and I guess you just mentioned it again, that when you optimize for the redistricting use case, that you're going to get errors other places. Is your sense that there's going to be like a set of use cases that are kind of deemed the most important, and it's tailored for whatever is released is tailored for those?
So the reason I focused on the redistricting use case is because those data are produced by statute, and they are expected to be optimized for the redistricting use case, full stop. So I don't feel like the Census Bureau has to repeat the obvious, that the data are supposed to be fit for use for redistricting, and they're fit for use for redistricting. The fact that they might be problematic for other unintended uses for those data is something that, to be blunt, you're gonna have to accept.
So we have a question from Pascal from the audience. It says, John, really nice and inspirational talk. You mentioned questions of fairness and anticipating the issue, the use. There seems to be a fundamental difficulty here because when once you release data, you have no control on how people will use the data. So that's a comment.
Yes, I was looking for the question mark and didn't see it. I can comment on it.
Sure.
Once again.
Can you hear me, John? Can you hear me, John?
Yes.
So the question is, how can you anticipate that people are going to use the data that is released in a fair and equitable fashion, in a sense?
So, Pascal, what did we do in the past?
So I mean,
I'll answer the question.
I think, well, you're returning the question to me, but the key point that I'm trying to make, John, is the following, right? So if you release the exact data, of course, you have no bias in it. If you release a data which is differentially private, you protect the sensitive data, but you can shape some of the decisions that people are going to do because of some bias issues. So there may be resistance to that, right? You see what I mean? So yeah. Can we reconcile these two objectives while you actually don't really know how people are going to use it? That's what I'm trying to ask. So,
yeah, so, and I have a very good answer for your question. I just wanted to stress that. First of all, we did release a very accurate image of the 2010 microdata, but it wasn't perfectly accurate. They had been swapped. And when you reconstruct them, you reconstruct the swapped image, not the unswapped image. But when I gave you accuracy statistics for that reconstruction, I compared them to the actual unswapped image. So it was a true representation of the accuracy. What needs to happen is that some statistics have to be official, populations for political entities. Other statistics are meant to guide public policy. And in that case, you don't necessarily want to force every user to use the tabular data that were set up for specific use cases. So we intend to release, in addition, the raw differentially private measurements. Those are unbiased, and teach users how to assemble them into other statistical products that meet use cases that the official data were not tuned to. That obviously has to follow the official releases. There can't be two official numbers. And if we do it, our own system will probably be constrained to always give political entities the same population as their official one. But that population is one of the numbers it's being tuned to, so that's an appropriate thing. She has had her hand up for a while, if you don't mind me.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
Hi. And hi, Ash. Saw you.
Hi, John. It's a very nice talk. Actually, I have a clarification questions regarding how Census collecting data. Is for instance, I want to compute how many people in this region. I may just gather samples of their population in that region, right? Rather than to really count one by one. And I'm wondering whether it might be a clarification. If this is true, whether the error in this sampling process be also included in the final confidence interval when we report a differential private answer, or the answer that query have already ensured it is fully accurate and perfect.
So there's no sampling in the census. Zero.
Zero. Okay.
Zero. By law.
By law. Okay, that's very good question. I mean, very good clarification. Thanks. And I have a second question. I think your Census have really made a lot of great progress in releasing differential private data statistics. And what do you think the next challenge, or the great important challenge that we should consider in research and also design or privacy preserving solutions?
So I think the most important thing I would like to call out is that statistical agencies in their official products are not in the big data world. So most of the work that is using AI systems that are ingesting data at the cell phone data volume level are not useful to the statistical agencies yet. We are trying to enter the world where we harvest that kind of data for statistical purposes. And so all that work will definitely prove useful. Trying to understand how to protect very expensive but high sampling rate surveys like the American Community Survey or the Economic Census is the next thing on our agenda. The data are vulnerable to reconstruction-based re-identification attacks, but they're wider than the census. There's many more fields that have to be protected, and the ways that we have conceptualized that have not yet generalized to usable techniques. I think that you're going to have some people associated with that work, but I don't think they'll be talking about it later today. I see one of them already.
Thanks.
Perfect. Well, thank you once again, John. So if I think time calls for the next session to start. Well, we actually have time for one more question, if there's any.
It's like I got off the hook easier than I will later today at the redistricting meeting. Fortunately, somebody else is taking the questions for that one.
Okay. Well, then thank you again, John. I was.
Thank you all very much. I enjoyed this. I would like to spend the rest of the day with you, but we actually still have a 2020 census to get out the door, so that's not possible. But I wish you well, and I hope you enjoy the rest of the day. Bye.
Thank you so much for being here. Virtual round of applause.